Good morning. My name is Dee LeBeau-Hein. I'm going to be presenting on the Great Plains Native American cultural lens to palliative care. We have a lot to get through, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This disclaimer says that the supporting host for this through Avera is through a grant, a HRSA grant. So what we're going to review in this training, you're going to learn about some Native American culturally sensitive approaches to palliative care for healthcare providers. You're going to be able to identify some cultural customs, beliefs, and protocols when working with Native American patients, caregivers, and families, and you're going to learn protocols to assist Native American patient families, specific protocols as it relates to healthcare and working with our relatives. So I'm a tribal member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, specifically from the Two Kettle Band. I've been in the field of working with our relatives for over 20 years. So a lot of the cultural curriculum that I work with supports this work. We want to look first at the demographics of our region. So in the Great Plains region, we look at 17 tribes. And those 17 tribes are located in South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa. So the bulk of those tribes are here in South Dakota. So looking at those tribes here in South Dakota, many of you might have heard the term Lakota, Lakota Oyate. Those are specifically individuals, tribal members coming from the Teton bands. And those Teton bands consist of the Ogallala Sioux tribe, the Sichangu Oyate, which is our Rosebud Sioux tribe, our Hunkpapa, which is our Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and then we have 4 sub-bands in our Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, which is Sanzark, Minnekoju, Two Kettle, and Blackfeet, not to be mistaken for Blackfoot, because there is a Blackfoot tribe. And then we have our Nakota Oyate, which consists of our Yankton bands. And we have our Ihanktawa Yankton bands, our upper and lower Yankton tribes, or little Yankton or big Yankton tribes. It depends on how a person looks at that, but that's who our Yankton bands are. And then we have our Dakota bands, which is our Santee bands. And they are our Sisseton, Wapton, Spirit Lake, and Leaf Shooter tribes, our communities up in the Santee area, Santee bands in the Sisseton area. So there are Dakota Oyate. So this is really important to understand because many of our people are very adamant about where they come from. So if you meet somebody and they say they're from South Dakota and they're enrolled in the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and you're over from maybe Sisseton, working in that area, Watertown or somewhere, and you might say, oh, so you're Dakota. They'll be real quick to correct you and say, no, I'm Lakota. So our people are very adamant about where they come from because this is their cultural identity. So it's important to understand where individuals come from and to be mindful of how you identify with them. It's important to understand some of these components as you're working with our Native American families. Our language, as you can see, as I just showed you, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people, they have a very distinct language dialect, which comes from each region. So if you have translators, or if you're needing to get a translator and you're in the Lakota Teton bands area, you'll want to get somebody that speaks Lakota, even though we do understand Dakota and Nakota, because what they do is they just replace the L with the D or the N in the word. So like a male to male friend is Kola, which is Kola. If I was from Sisseton, I would say Koda if I was a man. So they just replace the L with the D. So understanding that, if you're working with families and they're looking for translators, it's important to know that difference, and that women speak differently than men do. in how they end their words and say certain words. So if you're working with a woman, an elder, you'll want to have a woman translator working with her. We come from an oral history society where we didn't really document our history. Many of our stories and many of our legends and many of our teachings have been passed down through storytelling. We had a camp historian that would um, keep track of significant events on a winter count, and he would draw pictographs on a buffalo hide, and he would draw, like if it was a meteor shower, he would draw, stars falling from the sky, um, and then like if there was another significant event that had to do with a bunch of horses being killed, he would draw a horse with that was, that were killed. And these pictographs or these pictures on this hide would be in circular fashion. And every tribe had a camp historian. So in the wintertime, when we weren't traveling or moving camp, he would bring the winter count out and tell the stories. And that's how we retained our history and our knowledge and our teachings. The same it holds true with songs. If you ever go to a social event, a cultural social event, and you see a drum group sitting there, you'll notice that they don't have a song book or song sheets. They know the song by listening, and then they all know, we're taught that song by how they listen to that song. So we come from an oral history background, which is really important because many of our people still operate this way. I mean, of course, we can read and whatnot, but it's the traditional teachings have been better received through storytelling. And it wasn't until the early 1900s is when our winter counts went away, and life changed for many of our tribes when we were relocated and moved to different locations. Our belief system is really important. We were very much a God-centered people, creator-centered people um, in the beginning of time. Everything we did was in relation to Creator's guidance and support and prayer. So we believe in one God, Creator. We believe that spirits come and help, much like the angels help in the Bible when the Bible talks about that. We also have specific ceremonies that help with our teachings. Our belief is that we have a relationship with all living life sources, so like the water, the plants, the birds, the animals. We have a special responsibility to treat each life source with great respect and honor. So you might have heard the term mitaku ye oyasin, and that term really embodies that connection that we have with all living sources. That we're connected. We're all relatives. We're all in this life together, and we all honor and support each other. Our language is not translated literally. Our language is in terms of context and how it's being used. So that's important to understand as well, because there might be certain words you're wondering about, and an elder would say, well, how are you going to use it? And then they'll give you the translation. So bringing pride and honor to the family was really the utmost importance. Pre-European contact was peace and harmony was of the utmost importance within a tribal, a traditional camp structure. And we're going to look at some of those protocols and customs that supported that teaching of to bring pride and honor and have peace and harmony within the camp. In the United States, some of you may have come from other areas where you were exposed or introduced to tribal communities. We have 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and several of them are state recognized, but they're not federally recognized. And there's a little bit of different relationship that they have with the federal government. But they all have their very distinct cultures on how they practice their customs and ceremonies. But there is a common ground that we see across Indian country in the United States, and that's within our value system that our tribal communities, provide for the people. We're very much a communal communalistic environment. We take care of each other, and learning ways to help the people, perpetuate the well-being of our people. And elders and children were held in high regard, with great respect and honor, and the family structure really supported that. And you'll see that across Indian country. In the customs, we all have social ceremonies. We all have very private spiritual ceremonies, and we all participate and practice memorials and giveaways. So a social ceremony is any kind of ceremony that is done in front of the people, much like a naming ceremony, or an honoring ceremony that's done in front of the people, so the people can be a witness to and be a part of that. And then we have private ceremonies, spiritual ceremonies like prayer ceremonies that are done in a more private setting. And it's more just for the tribal members. It's not open to the community and things like that. But many of the tribes across the country operate this way, and they have specific ways of practicing their ceremonies, but they're also very distinct from their area. So I'm speaking mainly for the Great Plains tribes. I'm not qualified, and I don't feel like I can speak for the Yakima tribe or the Arapaho tribe or the Navajo tribe. I feel confident that I can speak on behalf of the Great Plains tribes, because that's where I'm from and that's where I grew up, and that's my teachings. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. The core ideals or the values that we typically see across the board are that of respect, gratitude, humility, and generosity. That those are really, really sound values that we embody in our life ways, and how we are taught to bring our children up. And it's across the board. You'll see this in all tribal communities that you go to. So just want to keep that in mind. So when we look at our health disparities and our mortality rates and things like that in Indian country, in the Great Plains regions, the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board track a lot of that information within our Great Plains region. IHS, the Indian Health Service, has a relationship with the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board here in Rapid City, and the IHS has reported that the Indian Health Service serves about 130,000 Native Americans in the Great Plains area as of 2010. So looking at that, the leading cause of death among our Native population here in the Great Plains region is heart disease. That's that is the number one leading cause of death. And then we go down to malignant cancer. Diabetes we're at a high rate of diabetes in Indian country here in the Great Plains region, along with chronic liver disease and cirrhosis. So those are your main your main health issues that lead to death among our Native population. So I want to introduce a concept here called the Red Road Approach. Gene Finnock developed this. He developed a cultural continuum, and this is going to be important for you as you work with our Native American families. So it'll make more sense as we move forward. So the Red Road Approach really looks at the life teachings of individual, how they were brought up, what they were taught, which determines how they communicate, their verbal and nonverbal communication, what their belief system is about, their value system is about, their cultural norms. All this is in a part of this cultural continuum that was developed by Gene Finnock. Now, he initially developed this in a treatment setting, but it can be used in other settings, and you'll see how that works here shortly. So here's the cultural continuum. It's believed that our Native American relatives fall somewhere on this continuum. You could talk to any Native American across the country, and they will fall somewhere on this continuum based on their upbringing, their cultural teachings, or lack of cultural teachings. So somebody that comes from a traditional oriented background, a traditional way of life typically is somebody that speaks and thinks in the language. So remember when I said our language is very much determined based on context. So when we talk about certain things, it's based on how it's being used in what fashion and whatnot. So a person that comes from a traditional background would understand that. And they interact mostly with their tribal community. They participate in spiritual ceremonies. Their lifestyle is very much consistent with their belief system. They know their tribal history. They know their stories and legends. They know their family background. You know their family tree. They know relatives and things like that. They also know and respect traditional family relationships. And I'm going to introduce you to the traditional family structure here in a minute. But they know the specific roles and responsibilities within that family system. And typically, somebody that comes from a traditional way of life, they don't drink or use drugs. You won't see domestic violence in that family from that individual. There's no child abuse or elder abuse or neglect. The family system is held intact. This individual would understand the value systems of honor and respect and care for their family, and they would practice that in their daily life. So somebody coming from a bicultural background would be somebody that has been introduced to Western approaches. So like going to school on campus, military, taking a job off the reservation or away from their tribal community. They've been exposed to the Western approaches, and sometimes a person that leaves the reservation and leaves their family structure, their traditional family structure, sometimes they struggle with acclimating into a new environment and learning the Western practices and protocols that come that way. So there might be some confusion. A person might have some confusion about their cultural identity, how they fit in, where they fit in, do they fit in? They might ask themselves these kinds of questions. And some people have a hard time acclimating, and they carry a lot of stress and anxiety and frustration. And then oftentimes they'll return home back to the reservation, and they stay there. They didn't acclimate well. While there are some that do well acclimating between both environments and teachings, and they do quite well between both worlds, and they're comfortable, and they're able to operate and adjust accordingly to those teachings. Somebody assimilated would be somebody that we usually see in our younger population. Our older population, like our grandparents, our elders, are more traditional in their teaching and their background, while parents like myself, I've been exposed to Western culture, teachings and practices, um, and approaches, while children sometimes aren't introduced to some of that. They're just immersed in Western teachings, and not anything from traditional. And that could hold true for somebody that maybe that was adopted out. Um, Somebody assimilated may not know anything about our culture or our spiritual ways. They might have maybe somebody mentioned that they were Native American, and they're quite happy with their upbringing where they're at, and they have no interest in connecting or learning about our traditional cultural ways. So this is could be by no fault of their own. They might have be assimilated because they were, like I said, they were adopted out, or their family relocated to a urban setting, maybe to Oakland, California, and the family just grew up out there. There's 3, 4 generations family that grew up out there, and they might come back to get enrolled, and that's the only reason they come back, is to maybe to get paperwork in, and maybe they meet a relative, and then they go back to Oakland or whatever. And but they have no interest in the culture, and that's okay. This isn't a right or wrong cultural continuum. It just kind of gives you a sense of where somebody might fall on this continuum. So this person might have some feelings. Maybe they were taught or brought up to not speak about their Native American heritage, or that's not important, or you're a child of God, it doesn't matter, or whatever it might be. For whatever reason, they're not interested, and have no interest to connect. So we don't want to make the assumption that somebody that is assimilated um, wants to know about this. And again, this is going to make sense as we move forward, because based on where they fall on this cultural continuum, is going to determine their verbal and nonverbal communication styles. So, so we often hear people, say, well, Native Americans, they're not, you don't look them in the eye. They don't like that. That's disrespectful. That would hold true if they come from a traditional background and they have that teaching. So in our tribal communities, our teachings, cultural teachings, is indirect eye contact. So I know when I'm sitting with my elders, or if I'm working in a tribal community, I know this protocol, so I know not to give my elders or those in authority that direct eye contact. But in Western culture, practices, it's part of the teachings to give direct eye contact. So much so that you might hear somebody say, tell their children, look at me while I'm talking to you, things like that. And it's expected in a meeting, with non-native folks. If you're talking with somebody, they're looking at you, and they kind of expect you to look back at them. But somebody from a traditional background wouldn't do that. They wouldn't look at you eye to eye. They would keep their head down. They would look past you, but they would never look at you directly. So somebody bicultural would know the difference. So I consider myself bicultural if I'm working with my tribal community. I know not to do direct eye contact, but if I'm working in a Western environment, in that cultural protocol, in a meeting, I'm expected to give direct eye contact. So that's important to understand, because some people don't know this. So somebody assimilated, wouldn't have any idea about this teaching because they've never been exposed to it. So that's an example of how the cultural continuum would work. The same with communication styles. We have traditional, somebody coming from a traditional background would be very verbal within their culture, but somebody from the outside comes in, they would be very reserved and quiet. So somebody assimilated, wouldn't know the difference. It would be very verbal in their communication style, while somebody bicultural would know the difference of where it's appropriate and where it's not, and what's expected and what's not. So being working with patients, working with families, maybe an elder, or would be working with their grandchild, and they're talking, they're visiting, they're doing well. You walk in the room and everything shuts down, they're quiet, and they're not going to say much. And you might even directly ask a question to the patient, the Native American patient, and they won't say anything. They'll look at their grandchild and they'll say something in Lakota, in the language, and then the grandchild will talk to you. So there's a protocol in that. Sometimes it's inappropriate to talk directly to a Native American patient if they come from this traditional teaching. They might have a person that speaks for them on behalf of their care. And you might have already experienced that in different families. But if they come from an assimilated background, they're not going to know the difference. They're going to be very direct with you. They're going to respond very direct with you. And somebody bicultural would know how to navigate that, where it's appropriate, where it's not. And then we have response times. Oftentimes, if you ask a direct question, Western culture will ask a direct question, they expect a direct response. This would hold true for somebody assimilated, they would understand that. But in our traditional environment, if I'm working with my tribal elders or somebody coming from a traditional background and I ask a direct question, they're going to sit there in silence for a while before they answer me. And when they do answer me, it's not going to be a direct response. They might start telling me a story. And in that story, I have to glean from that story where the answer is. So we have to understand that we need to give them time to process and think in the language. If they're from a traditional background, how does that relate to what you're asking? They're gonna articulate a response, but you have to give them time to think. But sometimes when we sit with our elders, we could sit in silence for 5 minutes, easy, 10 minutes. And if you're uncomfortable with silence, this might be a difficult thing. So somebody bicultural would understand the importance of response time. So if you're coming in and you're asking a direct question to a patient, and they're from a traditional background, they may not respond immediately to you, but their granddaughter, who's bicultural, would understand that you're expecting a response right away, and they would respond more direct with you. So that's kind of how this would play out in communication styles and working with Native American families. Here's one that we hear a lot of is time. Often we hear providers, healthcare providers, social workers, things like that, working with families, and they'll have an appointment, and then the family member doesn't show on time, and then folks get a little frustrated because they have a schedule that they have to adhere to. Um, but coming from a traditional background, we've never had clocks, so we learned how to operate by the event. So if they're having a gathering, maybe a cultural social gathering, and they might send out a flyer that says it's at 1 o'clock, and you get there, as you would, quarter to one, and well, here comes 1 o'clock, and it doesn't look like they're ready. The event isn't going to start until all the right people are there. Even though you see all these people coming in and all these people are, seems like they should be starting. If there's certain elders or certain individuals that have been invited and that aren't there yet, they won't start the event until all the right people are there. So very much event oriented, not clock oriented. They'll forego the clock. They'll wait a half an hour or however long it takes, and they'll go and then start the event. And this holds true with ceremonies. Um, they might tell you, if you're a healthcare provider, we have family coming, we're going to pray, they should be here about 5 o'clock. So you guys, might be getting ready to give them that space at 5 o'clock. Well, here you come at 6 o'clock and they still haven't started. You might start wondering why haven't you guys started? You said 5 o'clock, and well, the right people aren't there yet. They're on their way. So they won't start it until, again, all the right people are there. So somebody assimilated would be very clock oriented because that's the way they were brought up. So if it says 1 o'clock, they're going to be there at quarter to one, and they'll expect things to start right away. Somebody bicultural would understand the difference. And so, like for me, when I go home and I'm working with my tribal community, and I'm participating in any kind of social or ceremonial events, I know it's going to start when it's going to start, not when it says the clock says it's supposed to start. So I understand that, and I'm patient and I wait. Whereas if I'm working in a rural setting and I'm working with a non-native group, and they say 1 o'clock, I make sure I'm there at quarter to one, and because I know everything's going to start right on time. So this is important to understand if you're working with our native families, and you're operating from that lens. Um, Many families, like I said, if they come from a traditional background, will be event oriented. So just keep that in mind, because some things may not start on time like that you would think they should start. So I'm going to introduce you to the Native American family relationships. And this is a traditional family system. So many of our families still operate this way. So if I ask you how many family members are in your family, typically you're going to tell me, well, there's me and my brothers and sisters, and there's my mom and dad, and then there's my grandparents. And that would be your nucleus. That would be your immediate family, correct? So if I asked a Native American family, traditional family, who their family system, they're going to say this, but they're also going to tell me that their mother's sister is also their mother. Their father's brother is also their father. So now they're identifying two sets of parents, and their children are not going to be my first cousins. They're going to be my brothers and sisters, my siblings. So we see now I have more siblings. So if we look at it in context of my children, so we go down to the red, that's for female. So my children, are my children. My sister's children are my children. I consider them my children. So you go over to the mother's side and you see the women, the sisters, they're considered my children, and the brothers would be considered my nephews and nieces. And that holds true with my father on my father's side. And then my mother's cousin is also considered a mother. So again, her children are my brothers and sisters, and their children would be my children or my nephews and nieces. My father's cousin would be my father. Their children would be my brothers and sisters, and if they had children, their children would be on the sister's side would be my children, and on the brother's side would be my nephews and nieces. So this could go on and on and on and on. So oftentimes we see large Native American families, and they'll look at this. They don't, I mean, they're not showing this diagram, they just brought up this way, right? So that if you ask them how many brothers and sisters they'll say, a large number, and you're like, how can you have that many brothers and sisters? And then they might try to explain this to you, or they might say, I have more than one mother, I have more than one father. And the one that we often hear is the grandparents. Anybody of grandparent age is a grandparent, so they'll have more than one grandparent. So we don't say, well, how many grandchildren do you have? Well, I have 5. How many do you have? I have 9. They don't count it that way. Anybody of grandparent age is a grandparent, and anybody underneath them that is would be a grandchild. So remember when I said the elders and the children are held in high regard and they're respected and honored and whatnot? This is kind of part of that system. So grandparents are held as the wisdom keepers, so to speak. They're the ones with the history and the life lessons that they're going to teach us. So they're held in that place, as highly revered and respected and honored. Now think about before Columbus, pre-European contact. This family system was strongly intact, so that these dynamics were played out in a tribal community. So a traditional camp structure, you would see this family system operating this way with no questions asked. And if my biological birth mother wasn't available, I'd go to my auntie that you would consider auntie, which would be my mom, my other mother, and I would go to her and ask for help and then these teachings would they all play a role, have a role and responsibility to teach me, the women, to teach me to be a strong young woman and a strong mother, a caregiver, all these things. So these roles and responsibilities were very well defined in this family system. The fathers taught the young men how to be young men, took them on their first hunt, helped them to understand the importance of providing for their family, protecting their family, and all the male figure role models had that role in this family system. The children were taught to listen, to watch and pay attention and how things are done, and they're given opportunity to practice that. But there wasn't any exam or test at the end of it to see if they knew how to do stuff. They were just shown how to do things. And they had all these role models in this family system of people there to help them learn this process. So this family system also never identified each other by name. So I never called my sister Susie or my brother John. I called them by their role that they had in my life. So my sister, my Chue, my big sister, my brother, I had words to my Tiblo, my big brother, things like that. We called each other by our role that they played in our life. So you'll often hear Native American family say they have a lot of aunties, or they have a lot of grandmas, or I have a lot of brothers, I have a lot of sisters. Or if somebody's sick and you see them coming in the waiting room, you'll see a large Native American family come in, and you're like, geez, this is a big family. If you look at it from this lens, this is why, because they're all part of this family system. The other part of this is one of the protocols in here, or the customs, was if my husband went to on a war party and he got killed, I would be absorbed in by his brother into his family, his camp, as his wife and my children, his children, would be absorbed into this family system. So there was no such thing as orphans or widows, so to speak. We were absorbed into this family system to always be taken care of. So we didn't have homelessness. We didn't have abuse about anything going on. This family structure was very much intact and very strong in how they did things. Um, Another custom that we still see today is gender protocols. So like the mother-in-laws would never speak to their son-in-laws. They would never speak to their father-in-laws. They would never, much less even see them. So if I wanted to visit my daughter and her husband was around, I wouldn't go there. I would tell her I'm coming tomorrow when the sun's high in the sky, and she would tell her husband, Mom's coming, and he would leave. And then I would come and she would tell me it's safe to come in, and I would visit my daughter, and he'd be sitting on a hilltop somewhere watching me till I leave, and then once I leave, then he'd come home. But that was out of respect and honor, to not put ourselves in situations that would compromise or cause any discord or questionable behavior. So women spoke mainly to women and men spoke mainly to men. And the in-laws, we never crossed paths with our male in-laws. We never talked to them, things like that. And that's still in place today. Some families still operate that way today. So, and that's important to understand as you're working with a Native American family that's traditional oriented, because they're not going to feel comfortable with a male nurse if they're working with their grandma. They'll want a woman to come in and work with them. So it's those kinds of practices that are important to understand. So Western culture says it's okay for mother-in-laws to talk to their son-in-laws and father-in-laws and things like that. That's acceptable, but in a traditional sense, it's not. So that's important to understand. And this is some of the values and the teachings that are in place to support that family system and the tribal system. The tribal community maintains peace and harmony within the family system. And these are some of the protocols that are in place to ensure that. So looking at some of these cultural considerations as it relates to working in with palliative care, it's important to understand that traditional beliefs and practices related to somebody that is dying are teachings, traditional teachings, spiritual teachings, is that a person is preparing to return back to the spirit world. And that's a very sacred time, sacred journey. Just as it is when a child comes into this life, we have a ceremony that welcomes that spirit into this life, a birthing ceremony that's done very distinct in practices and how that's done. It's the same concept of when that spirit is ready to go back to the spirit world. There's very distinct and specific ways that they do that they practice that. So relatives are supported by their traditional healer, which would you might consider a medicine man, a spiritual leader, somebody that the community look to for spiritual guidance. It may not always be a medicine person. It could be somebody that lives their life um, consistent with their belief system, but they haven't been given the gift of medicine for healing, but they're still a spiritual leader. So there's a difference between the two. So the families might have a spiritual leader and or an elder come, and the family come and support their loved one as they're transitioning and preparing for their transition to the spirit world. So some of the things the families might do are a purification ceremony that you might know as a sweat lodge. Many families do this, and they'll have that's a time for prayer, and they're praying for their loved one that's going to be making their journey, to help them make that journey back to the spirit world in a good way, and that their loved one won't suffer. They won't, it'll be a peaceful transition. Those kinds of things is what they're praying for. And then they'll have an elder or a leader, spiritual leader, elder, or the traditional healer come and pray with their loved one that's preparing to take their journey, and also to help the family as they prepare to step into their grief process, their grieving practices, and their mourning. Um, many elements might come into play at this time. Spiritual leaders or medicine healers, they'll bring in certain elements for the family or for the loved one that's preparing to make their journey. And some of those elements, sacred elements, for smudging might be cedar or sage, sweetgrass. They might have around their loved one. You might see sage bundles laying next to their loved one, things like that. The chanupa, the pipe, somebody might come and want to pray with their loved one with a pipe. Somebody might bring traditional medicines in to help their loved one in their comfort. They might bring spirit food in as their spirit's preparing to make that journey, and for the ancestors that are coming and the relatives that are coming from the other side to help their loved one make that journey. So all these elements, sacred elements, might be around in the room, or you might see them and you wonder what they're for, a medicine pouch or things like that. And the family is very particular about the purpose and the importance of these elements and how they're going to be used. So for the most part, I'm guessing that many of you just know to not touch any of those things and to leave it to the families to handle that. But just to give you a sense of what those are there for, is to help in that process in helping their loved one make their journey through sacred prayers, through smudging, through ceremony, and things like that. The other thing is through prayer and song. Sometimes there are prayer songs, so they can sing songs or they'll orate the prayers. And usually an elder or spiritual leader does this. They'll come and they'll pray with the family, pray with their loved one, things like that, and they'll sing a song. They might bring a small hand drum, with and sing songs for them. That's what they're doing. There's certain songs for these things. Our belief is that if a person has a Lakota name, we're given a Lakota name, they're going to be called to the other side by this Lakota name. They're going to be there's going to be a passing when that transition makes, and then the teaching is that the spiritual elders that come from the spirit world will call them by that name. So some families, individuals don't have a Lakota name yet, and they don't know that, or they didn't get an opportunity to do that. So this is an important ceremony that a family will want to conduct with their loved one before they leave. So a naming ceremony they might ask you as staff if they can perform the ceremony, and what they need is, of course, just the time and space to do that with their loved one, which will involve singing, smudging, if possible, and prayer, and to help their loved one. I have an elder that was preparing for her journey, and she didn't have a Lakota name, so relatives came in, and the urgent care staff allowed them to perform this ceremony in their hospital room. So they sang that they gave her name, and then they sing a song to honor that name. And as they were singing that name, that honoring song, she transitioned and she made her journey. So that was really a powerful experience for the family, for their loved one that got to cross over by being called over by her name. It's those kinds of things that make a difference for families, because that could have been done differently. The urgent care staff could have said, no, we can't do that. And the family would have felt, kind of put off that they weren't able to practice their cultural teachings in that important time as their loved one was preparing to make their journey. So somebody bicultural, they might want to have a church leader there, as well as a traditional healer or a spiritual leader there to pray with their family and their loved one as they're preparing for their passing. So the last rites if they're Catholic, things like that. And families might be mixed. They might have two belief systems in one family. That's not uncommon to see. So you might see two different teachings coming in to support that family. And that's somebody coming from a bicultural background. Somebody assimilated that comes from that background and teaching would just have a spiritual leader, a church leader, or whatever their teachings are, would be the one that would be coming in to do the prayer and helping their loved one make that transition. But they wouldn't understand anything traditional. So like if you came in and say, "Oh, are you guys going to smudge? You know, are you going to have someone come in and sing in prayer?" They wouldn't know what you're talking about because they don't know that teaching. They're not traditional oriented that way. So we have to be careful in how we identify and what we ask. And you can kind of tell by the families that come in where their teachings are at by what they bring in. So when they're actually making that journey, the traditional teaching is the families, the traditional leader, the traditional healer will be there to assist the family with their loss. So there's certain things that they'll pray and they'll do over the body before they leave, before the funeral home comes. Oftentimes the women will be the ones to clean the body before they're taken to the funeral home. And I know certain hospice care providers and end of life care providers will come in and prepare the body before they're taken. But this is a very sacred time. So if you're able to allow them to do this in their cultural teachings, coming from a traditional background, it would mean the world to them. And it would be consistent with their teachings to allow the women to take care of the body before it's sent to the funeral home. The same is true when they get to the funeral home before they have the wake and before they have to start the funeral. It's the women that go in and dress their loved one at the funeral home and in preparation for the wake and funeral services. So these are very strong teachings. Um, this isn't locked in stone. So, but I just want to say that for the most part, it's the women that do this. So if they ask if they can stay and if they can prepare the body, and I've heard hospice care workers say that they've seen this, they are aware of it, and they just step back and let the family do what they need to. And that's a form of respect and honor that you're providing that family to allow them to do these things at the end of their life. Grief practices, it's important to understand this because you might be, as a healthcare provider, a hospice care provider, end of life care provider, comfort care provider, you might be asked to be a part of this because they really put a lot of faith in you. They really appreciate what you've done to care for their loved one and to make them comfortable and to support the family. So they might want to honor you in this process. So the grief practices, typically a family goes through 1 year of mourning, and there's certain protocols that happen during this time. A wiping of tears ceremony is conducted at the end of this year, and usually a memorial or a feed and a giveaway will happen. And they'll oftentimes invite you as a healthcare provider to be a part of that, to come in because they want to honor you and give you a gift for taking care of their loved one. So if you're able and if you feel comfortable, that would mean the world to the family if you can go and be a part of that ceremony. Some protocols of do's and don'ts. Cultural spirituality. It's important to understand, not to assume just because they're Native American, therefore they must be traditional. We don't want to make that assumption. They could be one or the other, or they could be both. We don't want to uh, when we're talking to a family, like I said, that communication style. Some families will not speak directly to you. They'll have a spokesperson that does all the talking to the healthcare providers, and that's consistent with our teachings. So if the patient themselves aren't talking to you directly, that's not, don't feel offended by that. And if the grandchild or the daughter or this, their child is doing all the talking, or whomever, their sister, whatever, of the loved one, that's important to understand that that's part of their teachings. And again, grief practices, end of life care, be mindful of the belief system that they come from so you can support that. Again, if they're traditional, you can understand some of those elements that are going to come in. If they're bicultural, you'll see both. You might have a pastor or a church leader come in along with spiritual leaders come in. If they're assimilated, they're just going to be just the spiritual leader, or their teachings background will be the one that'll be there. So healthcare providing prefer traditional healing ceremonies as opposed to Western medical practices, or they might want both. So at the end of life care, there might be certain elements that they might want to bring in, traditional medicines, traditional foods, different sacred items that they want to have a part of that end of life care. If they're actually crossed over, they passed away, then there's certain elements that they want to do. So just be mindful and not make the assumption that one is better than the other. The family will dictate that and guide that, and just so you understand that there is a difference. The other thing is communication. It is considered rude to talk in a loud voice. So if you're talking to a patient and their loved one isn't around at the time and the patient doesn't answer you, don't raise your voice thinking that they can't hear you or they didn't hear you or you're rephrasing it a different way, because raising your voice is considered rude. And even if the patient seems inattentive or they seem like they're not listening, they are. So when their loved one comes and they'll tell them that the nurse came and she was mean to me. She yelled at me, they might even say, when that wasn't the case at all. But in their mind, you know, they that's the way they perceived it. So the daughter might come out and say, my mom said she doesn't want to take her bath tonight, she'd rather do it now while I'm here, but she said you were mean to her, you were rude. And you might say, oh no, I just didn't think she understood what I said, and I raised my voice a little bit because I didn't know if she heard me or not. It's that simple. It's that simple that it could be misunderstood. So just be mindful of that as you're talking with our loved ones and our elders. And maybe they really can't hear, but then you would really want to work with their family member in that case and wait for them to return back to the hospital. In asking questions, again, allow them time to respond. Uh, Keep in mind that cultural continuum. They might be traditional and they might need time to articulate and to move it into the language and kick it back out in English. Biculturally, they'll be more quick to answer you, especially if their loved one is there. Culturally sensitive gender protocols, like I had mentioned, it's going to be, you're not going to want a male nurse coming in and doing, cleaning up the room and taking care of grandma. You're going to want to, if they're traditional oriented, they're going to want a female in there, not a male. And so you might want to ask, are you comfortable? If you're a male nurse, you might want to ask, are you comfortable with me, being here? The other thing is touching an elder's hair or a native person's hair. Some traditional teachings prohibit that from outside of the family. So I know some healthcare providers come in, and they come in and they want to help them, do clean up, and they might want to comb their hair for them and help them brush their teeth and wipe them down a little bit. You want to be careful with that because some traditional oriented people are very mindful that nobody touches their hair but the family members. And so you want to ask if they're comfortable, if their loved one isn't there with them, and you're working with the patient, and you want to ask that question. If they want to wait until their daughter comes back, that's fine. She can take care of your hair, like that. That you just want to be mindful of that. Direct eye contact, like I mentioned earlier, you want to be mindful of elders, women to women, man to man. If they come from a traditional oriented background, that's going to be more appropriate. But if they're assimilated, they're not going to know the difference, and they'll be very direct with their eye contact with you. Personal space, it's important to not sit right in front of an elder or sit right in front of somebody that comes from a traditional oriented background. You want to sit next to them and lean into that and talk, because you're not going to give them eye contact. And you also want to ask if it's okay. Is it okay if I sit here? And they'll let you know. So here's some strategies that you might want to implement: is identify a cultural champion in your organization, in the community, to mediate between the healthcare provider and the Native American family. Advocate for the Native American family. They'll be the one to understand that cultural continuum. They'll be the one to understand when it's appropriate to have a translator. They'll understand the protocols, and they'll be the advocate and the one between, and to navigate that and be the liaison between the family and the Native family and the healthcare provider. And they'll be the ones to support the individual and family in their cultural practices. They'll be the ones to make those referrals if they want us, they want a reverend or a pastor to come in and pray with the family. They'll understand that because they know the family. They know that they have have both belief systems in place for that individual, and the family's okay with that. They'll be the ones to be able to speak on their behalf. And they'll also be able to identify the resources, and know what resources are available, because many of our relatives don't have the means to come and be with their loved one 24/7. They don't have the means to stay at a hotel for however end of life care is. You say the doctor says 3 to 5 days or might be a week. They don't have the money to come and stay at a hotel for that long. So a person, a cultural champion or an individual would know what resources are available to help that person or the family to stay and be a part of that process with their loved one as they're preparing to make their journey. And they'll know the spiritual elders in the community who to call on to help support the family. So you can also develop a cultural assessment tool on belief systems and how that might impact or affect patient healthcare. We have that developed. If there's something you're interested in, you could feel free to reach out to me. But that's something that we've developed in one of the cultural trainings that we do to help individuals working with the Native American population understand what would be a good approach and what would work and what wouldn't work. So these are some strategies that you can put into play as you're working with our Native family. So I want to thank you for the opportunity for me to present on palliative care looking through a Native American cultural lens. If there's any questions, here's my email. I'm more than happy to answer any questions and do what I can to help you. Thank you.